All right. So, so I'm going to talk based on what I've been doing at NSF and based on what I've been doing as a researcher at the University of Chicago in the past and at the University of Illinois coming up in about 3 weeks. What's going on in terms of scientific software, what the challenges are, and how different elements of NSF and the overall larger community are responding to some of those challenges. So just to start with, I'm a program officer in the Division of Advanced Cyber Infrastructure, ACI. And what we do is that we try to support and coordinate the development, acquisition, and provision of state-of-the-art cyber infrastructure resources, tools, and services. We do also support forward-looking research and education in order to expand the future capacity and capabilities of the cyber infrastructure. And our goal is to serve the community of scientists and engineers across all disciplines whose work relies on advanced computation, data handling, and networking. So, having said cyber infrastructure, I'll mention what we mean by cyber infrastructure. This is a definition from Craig Stewart. It's that cyber infrastructure consists of computing systems, data storage systems, advanced instruments, and data repositories, visualization environments, and people, all linked together by software and high-performance networks, and with the purpose of improving research productivity and enabling scientific breakthroughs. So if we think about cyber infrastructure, there's a bunch of challenges that come out of that in general. In terms of science, the fact that we're having larger and larger teams of people that are trying to address problems involving more disciplines and involving more countries. And that we need to couple simulation, experiment, and observation in ways that are different now than they have been in the past, particularly as the amount of data coming both from the simulations and the experiments and the observations is increasing. In terms of data itself, right, we have the size, the complexity, the rates all increasing, probably another V that I'm leaving off. We have the question about interoperability, that we have different data sets that need to interoperate with each other, and then we also have data in different systems, and the systems need to interoperate with each other. The computing systems themselves are getting to be more heterogeneous. There's more cores, there's more different kinds of architectures, there's more levels of memory hierarchy. Balances are changing as as latencies basically do not change, but bandwidths increase quite dramatically. The limits on systems that we build and that we buy have changed. So if you ask like a supercomputer center in the past what they would build, what they would choose, it would be based on how much money they had in order to buy something. We're getting to the point where it's now going to be based on how much money you have to operate it or what the power cost is. System architectures and business models are changing as we're getting into clouds and virtualization. And network capacity is growing, and the fact that we have increased networks and increased numbers of things on the networks means that security is becoming much more important even in scientific applications where it hasn't been as important in the past. In terms of software, the applications are becoming more complicated because we have more and more types of physics that we're trying to put together into these packages, into these software. We have frameworks, a variety of different kinds of frameworks that can help do this. We have challenges in terms of data analysis and understanding, in terms of programming models and abstractions for both science and for data and for hardware. The complexity of the software is getting larger overall. It's relatively easy with work to make software efficient, but that work is counterproductive towards productivity. And so there's kind of a trade-off that you can either be productive or you can be efficient, but it's very hard to be both. We have issues about the end-to-end performance that's needed across very complex scientific workflows that might include things like data ingest, computational modeling, data storage, data movement, visualization, and maybe decision-making at the end. And thinking about that in terms of the overall performance is challenging. Issues about actually how we're sure that what we're doing is right and that we can redo it. And that it works as the systems change and if we have faulty systems as well. And then the fact that that industry is becoming a larger part of a lot of the underlying software and underlying systems that we use. But then we're building things on top in many cases, and we may be forced to use what industry is producing, and in some cases we may produce something that industry chooses not to use. In terms of people, we have challenges related to education and training, to the data science program here, trying to address some of those. How we actually build a diverse workforce, right? In computing, we've had pretty dramatic issues with diversity or the lack of diversity in the past, and things maybe are changing slowly. We need to really be thinking about people that are not just going to learn the technologies that they need to learn in college, but are going to be able to continue to learn as tools and technologies change over their life. We have to think about career paths, I think, differently than we have done at this point. Just as an example of this, if we have people that are building software at a university, right, what is their career path? Are they going to get tenure based on the software that they've produced? Well, I don't know. That's a good question at this point. If not, what else are they going to be doing? And then credit and attribution. So again, thinking of software as an example or data as an example. All right, if somebody writes a piece of software that's used by 10,000 scientists, do they get credit for that? If they patch somebody else's software that's being used by 10,000 scientists, do they get credit for that patch somewhere along the way? If they write a library that's not used by any scientist directly but is used indirectly, do they get credit for that? So there's a lot of interesting questions here. Okay, so trying to go back to the side of software briefly. I'd like to argue that software, including services, is essential really for the bulk of science today. I did a little kind of mini study about 4 years ago and looked at a few different issues of Science magazine and counted that about half the papers were software-intensive projects, and almost all of the ones that were not software-intensive projects, you could also see the role of software in those, even though it wasn't really the core of them. So research is really becoming dependent on advances in software. And within NSF, there's significant software development that's conducted across a variety of projects from large projects to small projects. And there's a wide range of software types, from system software to applications and modeling, gateways, analysis, algorithms, middleware, libraries, all sorts of things. The other thing that's important about software is that it's not a one-time effort, right? If you write software and then you don't do anything with it, the software will stop working at some point that may not be too far away. Sometimes it's called bit rot, which happens with data as well, but it's a different issue with data. So the development and production and maintenance of software are people-intensive as opposed to computer-intensive. Software lifetimes are long versus hardware. And so I believe that software has underappreciated value because of these things. So if we think about computational science research for a minute and how this works, we have a person who maybe thinks of a hypothesis. They get some resources in order to test that hypothesis. Those resources might include funding, software, data, computing, other things. They perform the research. They might build some software and some data themselves. They publish their results after they've come to some conclusion, and those results might be in the form of a paper or a book or software or data or something else. And that's really where the knowledge is that's being transferred. And then they go back and they start this again. And somewhere along the way, they actually want to gain recognition as well for this knowledge that they've gained. All right, so I would argue that this is kind of the traditional thing that's happened in computational science over a number of years. If we think about data science, I think the only thing that's really different is that perhaps the hypothesis is coming based on the data versus the other way around. So maybe you're looking at some data and that gives you some clue about something. But it's basically very similar other than that. So where does software come in and what are the purposes of software here? All right, so one thing is that there's actual research that's done that's incorporated in software, and the research might be research in how to do the software. And that happens right in this research step. But there's also software that's infrastructure. And that happens in terms of the things that other people have built that you need to acquire to do your own research, as well as when you're potentially publishing software as a result. Right? That then also can be infrastructure that other people can use. Right. And so then I think that's the thing that I want to talk about is the role of software within the infrastructure category more than the research category, and what the challenges are that are associated with that. Okay. Again, just to go into this a little bit more, if we think about these two different kinds of software, research software versus infrastructure software, we have the idea that there's software for research. It's funded by NSF, for example, in my case, by a lot of different parts of NSF, all the different science and education directorates. Sometimes it's explicit. Often, though, it's implicit. Right? People kind of hide the software development in their project. They don't say that this project is intending to build software, but they need to build software along the way. And the software maybe is archived for future use and for reproducibility, but more likely than not, it probably isn't today. Okay, and then there's other software that's intended as infrastructure. And the infrastructure software, again, can be funded by a lot of parts of NSF, but in particular, my division, Advanced CyberInfrastructure, does fund it. And when the software is infrastructure, it's almost always the purpose of the project. It's always very clear that that's what we're trying to do. And the software is intended for use by a community, not just by that one researcher. So again, I'm going to talk mostly about infrastructure software, but there's a lot of issues that cross between, and reproducibility is probably the thing that causes the most overlap. Because even if you're thinking of research software as software for you and infrastructure software as software for other people, you can think about reproducibility as software for the future you in 5 or 10 years. And so it's kind of in between a little bit. Okay, so again, having said this previous piece, I'm just going to label things briefly. So H for hypothesis, acquire resources, perform research, publish, and gain recognition. And so I'm just going to use this little chart in some of the future pieces and highlight little pieces of it that are appropriate to those different challenges. Okay, and the challenges I'm going to talk about are software engineering, portability, training and education, incentives, citation, credit models and metrics, intellectual property, publication and peer review, software communities and sociology, sustainability and funding models, career paths, software dissemination, catalog, search and review, multidisciplinary science, and reproducibility. And I think that's it. Yep. And these are all tied together. So anything that happens in one of these is going to affect more of them, most likely. Because this is intended to be an hour talk, and it's probably not quite an hour, hopefully, I'm not going to talk about any of these in great detail, but I just kind of want to highlight them and give a little bit of information on what I see as the challenges in each, and some ideas of what people are doing to address those challenges. So to start off with software engineering, which I'm saying is basically just down in the research category primarily, the question is, I think one of the main challenges here is what software engineering practices, either from theory or from industry, actually work in science. And I don't think the answer is all of them. It's some set of them, and some of them maybe need to be changed as well. And so some of the issues that come up is that for science software, there's significant student and early stage researcher labor, which is pretty different than industry in general. There's a prevalence of idiosyncratic architectures, HPC architectures in particular, that require skills that are not mainstream skills in software engineering. We have the fact that there's a lot of turnover, much more than in other things. So students graduate, staff are hired away. We have a faculty member perhaps who had students working, but that faculty member maybe isn't the person that actually wrote the software, and so then what do they do and how do we preserve things? And then we have the issue that software development best practices like the agile methodology are not really well understood or easily transferable to the scientific environment in general, although again things are probably changing to some extent. So there's a lot of ongoing discussion and debate. Again, this is kind of the community response part of this. There's been 3 workshops on software engineering for high performance computing and computational science and engineering at the SC conference. That's one example of how people have been trying to talk about this and see what's going on. There's also something called the Computational Science and Engineering Software Forum that's kind of starting to look at this and trying to address this a little bit. And then there's this work from Barry Boehm on balancing agility and discipline. So there are academic studies that are starting to look at this as well. And so again, I think there's progress, as there will be with all of these things, but the progress is potentially is slower than we might like. Looking at portability, maybe a question is how do we write software that works on many platforms in many situations? And there's a lot of different views of the science world and the corresponding software. So, all right, so we have people that think of data as data in files. We have people that think of data as data in databases. We have the kind of HPC versus cloud versus web issue. We have people that think of CPUs and people that think of GPUs. We have people that write in Fortran and people that write in Python. We have people that think of computational science and people that think of data science. And in all of these cases, people write software based on the way that they're thinking. And so it's never clear if that software can exactly be reused for a different platform, a different storage idea, a different language. Again, yeah, so each set of decisions. And so the question is, can we do better than this? And I think this is maybe one of the bigger challenges that I don't really have much idea right now what the answer is, other than people talking to each other and trying to look at things from more than just one point of view as they do their software development. In terms of training and education, one of the questions that comes up there is how to actually use software to teach science. And so some of the challenges there are that the lecturers need to know what's available and what researchers actually use, and I'll come back to this in the dissemination challenge. And developers need to consider a spectrum from advanced researchers to novices when they're designing interfaces for science applications. And this doesn't always happen today. Again, another part of this is how to add software training then to the science and CS curricula, so that the people that are learning to be scientists also have some knowledge about how to write software, how to write better software. And this could be formal, but in many cases that might not really work very well. So an example that's been told to me a number of times is that chemistry PhD students typically take about 4 courses during their PhD work. And so adding a course on software is going to be pretty hard in that case. The other question, even for areas like computer science, where there are more courses typically in graduate studies, is that there's a bunch of courses that are required and people are expected to take, and if we're going to add software in, what are we going to take out so that it fits? And I don't know the answer to that. One of the other things, though, is maybe more informal mechanisms. So things like software and data carpentry, I think are a really nice model that people can sign up for and go to a couple of days training and learn to do better software, learn to do better data systems. But because they're voluntary, they only take the people that feel like they have a problem and want to do this. And this is one of those situations that people that have a problem may not know that they have a problem. So, okay, on incentives and citations and credit models and metrics. So I've hypothesized that gaining credit for software will encourage people to produce it and share it. And I've been trying to make that happen at NSF. If we want to say that, then we have to figure out what we're going to actually measure in order to give people credit. And we can measure things from how many times is software downloaded, which is probably the easiest to measure but has the least value, down to things like how many papers that cite software are themselves cited, which would be the hardest to measure but may have the most value. Right? And there's a range in between, and there's other things we can also look at. How many times is the software built? I don't know, other things like that. And so somewhere in here we have to figure out some median ground where we can measure something, but it's something that's worth measuring. Alternatively, right, we can measure downloads, installation build, use run, and impact. All right, so this is maybe a better chain of what we might want to do, where each one of these is adding value. But again, we have the same question that as we get further and further down, it's harder and harder to actually measure these things. So if we want to measure some of these things, right, downloads is pretty easy. We have repositories, logs, stats, things like that on a web page. If we want to measure things like installation and build, we could add like a phone home mechanism at the build level. For example, you can add a curl to a URL on the makefile. Is something that a few people have done, and that then lets them know how many times that makefile has actually been used. In terms of measuring use and run, we could try to do things where we imagine kind of tracking things centrally, where we maybe add a phone home mechanism at a run level. Again, we put like a curl to a URL and a code. For a set of applications, there are some interesting things. The Sempervirens project and the Debian popularity contest kind of are examples where people are trying to build systems that might help track usage of a set of applications. And the other question is, can we do things where we track locally and we ask the user to report? So when we have software, can it say, right, this software used this library, we'd like you to cite this library in your paper, as an example, or do something else like that. And Galaxy is an example of a framework that tells you exactly what you've used when you run something through it. In terms of impact, I think project credit is an interesting example of a way of looking at of how different pieces of a scientific work come together and who's done what. Mozilla has contributorship badges that are intended to recognize the project credit roles. Sorry, I'm going to say a bunch of things that may or may not be things you're familiar with. So if I say something that seems interesting, you can certainly ask me about it or come back to it later. Everything should be pretty easily Googleable as well. There's a Force 11 software citation working group that I'm co-chairing that's trying currently to define software citation principles. And then later on, we'll go to an implementation phase where we work with publishers and indexers and try to ensure that software is getting picked up in these systems that we use today for papers. There's a project called Code Meta, which is trying to develop a kind of a crosswalk of different metadata schemas that are used for science software in different projects and kind of integrate them so that there's one single accepted set of metadata that people will sign up for in terms of different science software. And then lots of different research projects, including something that I'm doing called transitive credit, which again is trying to look at how do we measure the impact of software. There's also altmetrics. So this is, I would say, getting to be a pretty standard thing. I saw something today that altmetrics is now measuring papers on Explorer, on IEEE Explorer. So I thought that was kind of encouraging. It's not citations, but it's other structured measures of discussions of a work. Things like tweets and blogs and things like that, right? Which count probably differently than citations, but also count in some way. And then there's things like impact story, which is trying to look at basically altmetrics plus citations plus other things for particular projects, and then something called DEPSI, which is from the impact story team, which is really looking at software specifically and trying to measure software impact by downloads, by software reuse. Right, so in GitHub, if one package is based on a fork of another package, right, then that original package probably should get some credit when the second package is used. Right, and that's what DEPSI is trying to do. Okay. Okay, so intellectual property, I would say, has been a challenge in the past. I'm not sure that this is so much of a challenge at this point anymore, but the idea here is that producing software to be shared at a university means that you probably need to have some understanding of the university IP policies. And at many universities, publications are a mark of scientific output and prestige, but software is considered something of potential monetary value. And so the policies may be different on these things. If somebody is going to make money off the work done by the university, then the university often feels like they should get some of that money. And so that can lead to policies that make open source difficult or require open source to be non-commercial only. And license choices can make a big difference in software because the license you pick may negatively impact who's going to use your software, even if that's not what you intend. Again, if there's no money to be made, the university is probably going to be happy with open source, but doesn't really necessarily help it happen. The creators often may need to state that the work can't be commercialized, or again, there might be some license that requires non-commercial use only. I think this has really been changing a lot recently, and most universities now have at least some recognition of open source as being valuable. But one way to get around this and often in some cases is that if you have a project that's an NSF project and you say that you're going to produce open source software under some license, the university will say that's what we've signed up to, is that software will be produced under that license, even if that's different than what the IP requirements normally would be for the university. Right, and the final thing just to say about intellectual property is that the goal of scientific software projects should be science impact, not open source for its own sake. Right, so I don't think that anybody wants to write software for the purpose of writing software, but they want to write software because they think it's going to be used for something interesting. Okay, on publication and peer review, one of the challenges is how should software be published? One answer is software papers, which effectively are just papers about a particular software package. This easily fits the journal and conference model that we're used to. And there's a list, for example, of I think this has something like 60-something journals that accept software papers now. All right, so papers that are about a piece of software, not that necessarily are doing some science. There's also on the other side this question about publishing the actual software itself. And we have this nice quote from Donahoe, basically, that says that an article about a computational result is advertising, it's not scholarship. All right, the actual scholarship is in the full software environment, code, and data that produce the result. And that's the thing that potentially that we should be publishing, right? Not the advertising about it. So if you like that side, then there's the Code as a Research Object project that came out of Mozilla Science Lab and led to this GitHub Zenodo linkage where you can make your code citable. If you have code on GitHub and you have a release, you can have Zenodo basically suck in the archive of that release, fill in some metadata for it, and give it a DOI. And now you have some citable object that is that archive of that piece of software. And it's pretty easy to do. One of the problems, though, is that if you do that, you don't have peer review, which you do in the case of a software paper. Right? And we don't really know, I don't think at this point, as a community, how software should be peer reviewed. And I think this is an open question. So we don't know what to check, if it's the code or the environment or the performance or a set of tests or a set of results. For example, if you're just thinking about this, let's say that you're an editor of a journal that's accepting software papers. All right, what are the review instructions that you're going to give to people for those software papers? Are you going to ask them to download the software and do science with it? Are you going to ask them just to see if it builds? We don't really have a good answer right now for this. And there can be issues, particularly with hard-to-access resources, like an HPC system that the reviewer may not have access to that the developer did have access to. So how do they verify that that actually made sense? Another question is just, right, how many reviews are needed? Right, so there are some conferences now that are looking at computational artifacts, and they have a number of peer reviewers, maybe 2 or 3 that look at the description, and then potentially they have one grad student that's asked to look at the artifact itself and check that. And I don't know if that's the right model or not, but that's one that some conferences are using. Journals, again, have different ideas, but there's no convergence and really no standards yet. And there's nothing in place for non-journal publications. So potentially maybe science review of software should be done by the science communities that are going to use that software, maybe by those organizations. So maybe the IEEE Computer Society should be responsible for peer review of computer software, computer science software. Right? AGU maybe should be responsible for geo software. It's right, lots of questions. Or maybe it's the publication site itself. So Zenodo, as I mentioned before, can take in an archive, but there's no peer review. Maybe we should add a peer review mechanism to Zenodo so that if your software is peer reviewed, you get an extra, maybe you get an extra flag saying peer reviewed or something like that. Right? I don't know. These are all questions at this point. Okay. Thinking about software communities and sociology, right? So the goal of software developers is often to get engagement within software communities. The engagement means that there's going to be people that take meaningful and valuable actions that produce a measurable result. Right? This is how you build a software community. There's a nice definition of engagement that it's motivation plus the support that's offered by the project minus the friction that the project makes that makes things hard. And so there's kind of different kinds of motivation. There's intrinsic motivation that encourage people to work on software, right? Self-fulfillment, altruism, right? The pleasure of sharing, the fact that they're making a contribution to science. Right? There's extrinsic motivation, the fact that maybe your job is helping you, that you're getting, you have a proposal that says you're going to do this, so you're going to do it. Right? People are going to see you as a valuable person. You'll become a member of this community. All right? In terms of the support, right? These are things that the software project does, like making it easy to work on the software, making it relevant, valuing what you do. And then there's friction, right? So if you're, just as an example, if you've been using, let's say CVS as your version control system for a long time, and you're going to work on a project that requires Git, that might be a source of friction for you. There's also questions about how long it takes you to do things, what kind of access you have, and what kind of knowledge you need. Okay. On sustainability and funding models, right, this is one of the big issues from the point of view of NSF. Sustainability, I think one of the better definitions is the capacity to endure. And for software, sustainability means that the software is going to continue to be available in the future on new platforms and meeting new needs. And if I talk as a program officer about sustainability, the kind of flippant comment that I'll give a bunch of times is we're going to fund you to develop software, and we want you to tell us what's going to happen after we stop funding you, right? How is that software going to stay around? And so that's a sustainability plan in my mind as a program officer. Software is often funded, again, explicitly or implicitly by 3 to 5 year grants. But the software projects themselves are often longer than that. And so the developers need to kind of plug together a bunch of different grants and have the software somehow created and maintained over those. In commercial software, having more users for your software means that you get more revenue, which gives you more ability to support those users and to add new features and to do things like that. But in research software, having more users often means that there's more time needed to support those users and less time to add features. And so there's kind of this perverse counter-argument in some ways. And so, right, we don't know what the solution is for this yet, other than hoping that some of those users actually help you do some of the support along the way because they get involved in the project. Researchers want to work with their peers, including those in other countries, but funding agencies are often set up nationally and struggle to fund international collaborations. Right? And this is clearly a problem, and it's not one that I have any idea what the solution is to. As a program officer, I've worked fairly hard to do some international projects, and they're very hard to do, and there's not a good answer to that. One of the other questions is how we actually make funding decisions. And ideally, we'd like to make funding decisions based on the impact of software that doesn't exist or the impact of software in the future. but we don't really know what that's going to be. And so maybe we can start to make funding decisions based on metrics from the recent past at least, which goes back to this question about how we actually measure the impact of software. And then the last thing is that I think we have to really be careful about examining new delivery and sustainability models. Right, so some software that's really delivered as platform, some that's delivered as a service, some that's delivered as containers, potentially those choices have large impact in some of the sustainability models. But I don't think that we really understand that yet. Okay, on career paths, the challenge here is really very simple. Are there appropriate career paths for people that are working on software? And there's, I would say, kind of two different kinds of people. Right? So one are people who are not software developers but do some software development as part of their job, and the other is people who are software developers. And in both cases in universities, I don't believe that there are necessarily the right career paths currently. University structure and academic culture rewards publications, not software, which is a problem. And for software developers, industry often offers better financial rewards. It offers cohorts of people that you can work with, and it offers promotion opportunities. And because of that, we have this problem that permanent postdocs don't really work well. This is a picture of the Google bus. This is actually a nice story that I'll just mention briefly. Phil Bourne, who's now the Associate Director of Data Science at NIH, used to work at University of California at San Diego, and he would train people to work on software and data in his lab, and they would be there in San Diego for a while, and then they would get frustrated with this university structure and academic culture situation. And they would discover that there's a Google office in Irvine, just a short bus ride away, and that Google would even provide this bus to take them back and forth so they didn't have to move. And so this was the problem that would happen, is that we would have people that wanted to work in science, but were not able to find a job that actually felt right to them in science, and they would go off and do something else, and we would lose them in science and engineering. So there's some potential solutions to this, I think. So the idea in the UK, there's a job category that's been created across all universities that's called Research Software Engineer, or RSE, and it's being funded by one of the funding agencies there. Because the UK universities all are run by one government in some sense and are all public, it's much easier to create a change in the job structure than it would be in the US, right? Because here you'd have to change, right, the state of Indiana's public laws, the private laws at Notre Dame, whatever policies at Notre Dame, everything else. But there actually are some things that are going on, I think, in US universities as well. So university centers, as the ones I mentioned, and are one example. The CyberInfrastructure activity here, Pervasive Technology Center, as an example as well, potentially. And then things like the Moore and Sloan Data Science program are another way that, that two private foundations are trying to get universities to change their structure by creating some incentive in the short term based on the university's willingness to change in the long term. Okay. In terms of software dissemination and catalogs and search and review, I think we have questions about how do people find software that they're going to use? Right? Should the software be in a catalog? And there's arguments that you can make for catalogs and software in catalogs, such as that funders want to have a list of projects they support. Users want to know what software is likely to be around for a while. The catalog could say who funds it, how big is the user and developer community, how often is the software updated, right? What others use it for, what do they think? It could be kind of like an app store model in some sense. And developers want other people to be able to find and use their software as well as to cite it. And so I think a catalog has a lot of advantages. If we were to do this, then we would need to have unique identifiers for each item. We would actually need somebody to build these catalogs and these indices to store the identifiers and metadata and pointers to code and potentially reviews and other things. And we need people and services and interfaces to make all of this work. And so we might imagine things like manually created catalogs. So in the SI2 program, we've had a catalog of the things we've supported for a little while. DOE has had a catalog of things they've supported in at least one program. There's an astronomy community that supports a catalog of astronomy software. And you can really list anything that you want as long as you have human effort to actually build it. But how you actually maintain any of these catalogs over time is very unclear. As far as I can tell, almost all catalogs seem to eventually stop being maintained. Free code is an example of a semi-commercial one that had this problem. The SI2 one is actually in the midst of having this problem now as we change program officers. So another option is semi-automatically curated catalogs. So things that are mostly robotic but involve a little bit of human intent. And DARPA Open Catalog, the NASA Code Catalog are examples of this. And they use I never know if this is DOAP or DOPE. So however this is said. But they basically use a JSON file that the developers need to put into their repository. And then the catalog can pick up the information that the developers put in and kind of build that catalog semi-automatically. It still has some maintenance issues, but it's less than the fully curated catalog. And then Hub Zero is kind of another example of this, that there's a collaboration environment that includes software publishing. It creates DOIs for software, and it can run code in a hub environment, and people can review and rate the software. The other thing that I should mention, though, is that internet catalogs, which existed 10 or 15 years ago, have almost all gone away, and they've almost all been replaced by index and search now. Right? So we don't have catalogs of websites anymore, mostly. In a couple of places we still do. And so maybe there's some solution for software that's based on index and search rather than on catalogs. And maybe something like an open software index, like Google, but for software, as an example. Based on DOIs of published software, with sufficient metadata that makes this work, and maybe using these files that actually describe the software. But probably not just in one repository, and ideally with the curation and peer review process that goes along with it. And maybe with some kind of flags or badges that can be attached to the software. Right? Some automated tests so that you get some kind of little flag that says this software has been tested within the last month and still works. Maybe some other flag that says this software has been peer reviewed. Maybe some flags that say this has lots of thumbs up from users. And maybe something that says this one is NSF funded or this one is NIH funded or something else. So I think it's possible to imagine something like this. Whether or not this actually could be done and will be done, I think is still a question, though. Okay. On multidisciplinary science, we have the question that producing software requires skills in a bunch of different disciplines, science subject area, computational or data science area, software engineering, computer science, probably math as well. Different disciplines come with different practices and different jargons and different methods and different reward structures and different priorities. And so putting all of these together can be pretty hard to do. And the skills can exist in one person or in more than one person. And if you have more than one person, we have a pretty well-known set of team challenges that apply to this, and including the fact that all of the members really want to be partners, not clients. All right, so this is something that happens often in computer science, is that all right, people in a science domain come to computer scientists and they say, can you build this for me? All right, but there's no computer science research in it, and so the computer scientists don't want to do it. All right, they want to be partners, not clients. If this is all in one person, then we have a tremendous career path challenge about how this person fits in a university and how they get promoted. But in both cases, we have the problem that academic departments often reward work that happens within the silos, but not across them. Okay, reproducibility. I think this is probably pretty well discussed at this point by lots of people, but I would say that in scientific culture, we say that reproducibility is important at a high level, but we don't actually follow through in specific cases. And so we have Mark Twain's definition of classic books that are those that people praise but don't actually read. And that's pretty much similar to how we talk about reproducibility. And part of the reason is that we don't have incentives or practices that actually say that reproducibility needs particular actions that support actual reproducibility. And reproducibility can be hard, again, due to unique situations, right? Data that's taken from a unique instrument or transient data, a unique computer system was used. And finally, given limited resources, funding, time, everything else, reproducibility is almost always less important than new research. And for example, a computer run that took months is unlikely to be repeated because generating a new result that takes that same number of months is going to be a better use of computing resources than reproducing the old result. So some of the solutions that we can think about for this is easy solutions is maybe that we have some reviewers or all reviewers of publications. Maybe we should require them to reproduce some of the results or all of the results. An example of this is in Tom's mathematics journal that has a replicated computational result review process that started within the last 6 to 12 months. And artifact evaluation processes that were happening in a few different software engineering conferences. Again, so some of this is starting to happen a little bit. Maybe funders should support reproducibility and require reproducibility statements in project final reports. I think this would be very hard for me to imagine getting through NSF very quickly, but it's something that if a community thought was important and pushed it, it would happen. So again, it's a question. Maybe faculty require some new students to reproduce part of the work of other students or some work in papers as a way of starting their own learning, and also helping then with some of the reproducibility issue. Again, on the harder parts for these unique situations, maybe we can isolate the unique parts and reproduce the parts around them, or maybe we could use some kind of thought experiments where we don't have the unique resources. Overall, we have to think about the benefits and costs and decide, and this is not NSF deciding or me deciding, this is everybody deciding. And so that's again, a challenge. Okay, so again, there's lots of challenges. I think that most of them are tied together. I've kind of hinted at some of those ties here. Ideally, if we make progress in one, it helps the others as long as we're actually thinking about all the challenges, but there's some danger of making choices to help address one challenge that might hurt in some of the others. There's many groups and communities that are interested, and I'll talk about those on the next slide. And I think there's actually good progress that's underway for a lot of these different challenges. And I would say actually that the future is fairly bright for this. I think if we come back, let's say to this room, assuming this building is still here, like in 30 years, I think we'll be in a much better situation than we are now, and there will be a lot of progress on almost all of these areas. And the question, I think, for us here and whoever's listening remotely is what we can do to actually make that not take 30 years, right? If there are things that we can do to make that happen more quickly. Okay, so some of the groups that are active, public and private funding agencies. So NSF, NIH, DOE, the research councils in the UK as public agencies, Sloan and Moore and Helmsley and Wellcome as private agencies in the US and UK. Sorry, I'm not as good at other countries. There's a lot of companies and projects that are trying to help in this area. So GitHub, Zenodo, Figshare, Archive, DataCite, Crossref, Vivo, Orchid are all kind of putting in different pieces to try to standardize particular things or make some part of the situation better. There's community practitioners and advocates and researchers. So an example of this is the Working Towards Sustainable Scientific Software Practice and Experience, or WSPE group that I've been organizing conferences for. The Research Data Alliance that was meeting up until yesterday in Tokyo. Force 11, which is a group that's having a conference, Force 2016, in Portland next month. And then there's publishers and indexers. And like Scopus and Web of Science are examples of products that actually are starting to do this. I think, I'm trying to remember which one. I believe that Web of Science now has a data type data publication type that they're working on, and they're thinking about software. Could be Scopus, I may have those backwards. But then there's issues like Google and Microsoft that at this point in their Scholar or academic search capabilities still don't think software or data are things that they should be searching and reporting on. Okay, so if I think about the NSF view, kind of to think about what we're doing at NSF to try to address some of these things, again, from software as infrastructure. We have a vision of what we're trying to do that has 5 parts. And I would say the core part is that we're trying to make sure that the software ecosystem is available to have the capabilities that people need to do their science and engineering. And we have programs like the SI2 program, which has different elements, SSE and SSI, and the ABI program is another example of programs that are actually trying to support the software ecosystem. We also have activities that are trying to support foundational research to build the initial software and explore the ideas that then will be moved into the ecosystem later. And almost all NSF programs really have the ability to support this basic research. We have the idea that we want to actually then use the software to make sure that it really is being used well for science and engineering problems. And we have in SI2, we have an institute level activity that's trying to do this. We have these questions about policy, about culture and dissemination and reproducibility and all these things I've just been mentioning. And right now we're trying really to partner with the community. There is no single one program within NSF that is doing these things, although we had a Dear Colleague letter about 1.5 years ago with the SBE Directorate to look at data and software citation models and to understand those better. And we funded 7 small projects and 3 workshops, and all of those are going to be coming together in June and talking about what they've done, and then we'll see where things go from there. And then finally we have education. Right, so again, the challenges here, this dual challenge is to make sure that the software ecosystem actually can be used in education and make sure we're educating people to be able to develop the software of the future. And there are some learning and workforce development, or LWD programs in ACI and other NSF programs that can help with this. In terms of the SI2 program itself, as I mentioned before, we have a bunch of different pieces. So we'll fund software elements, people building small bits of software for others to use. These are up to $500K for 3 years, and we funded about 80 of these at this point in 6 rounds. We have software frameworks, which are projects that can be up to $1 million a year for 5 years. Basically, frameworks meaning putting together multiple elements, whether they come out of the SSEs or whether they come from somewhere else. And we funded about 50 of these currently in about 5 years, and we're almost done with another round of these. And then we have software institutes, which are intended to really bring the software together in a particular community. And we've had conceptualizations of institutes, and we currently are in the process of doing review and award for institutes that are going to be in the science gateways and in the chemistry and material science area. And if those are successful, then we can imagine expanding that into other science areas or other technology areas. We do imagine and expect that as we give more funding and we have larger and larger projects, that they involve and impact larger and larger communities, and that all of the software that we're developing is intended to be reusable. So if you're interested in more about this, I have a blog where I talk about some of these things, and some of these slides were taken kind of from blog posts. I also have a bunch of slides that are online, and a different version of this talk, but pretty similar version of this talk, that I gave in North Carolina about a month and a half ago is available there, and I can also distribute a PDF of this for anybody that wants. I'll send it to the host who can figure out how to distribute it. WISPE, as I mentioned, is a community effort that's trying to work towards sustainable software for science. We've had 3 large meetings and 2 small meetings, and we'll have another meeting probably in the fall, somewhere to be determined, as well as a meeting that will be at the SciPy conference probably in August. The UK has something called the Software Sustainability Institute that's really working on almost all these issues as well, and it's a very good source of information, even if it's a little bit hard to join because it's a UK activity. Force 11 I mentioned before. Force 11 is a future of research communication. I don't remember what the E is. Future of research communication and something with an E. And the Mozilla Science Lab is another example of a way that people are coming together to address some of these things. We had a workshop called Computational Science and Engineering Software Sustainability and Productivity Challenges, or CESP. We like S's in our workshops and communities for some reason. And there's a report for that that's being drafted. And that website kind of talks about the talks that were there, and it will have the report when it finishes. And then about a year or so, maybe a little more than a year ago, there was a nice software and data citation workshop that led to, I think, a pretty good report as well, and that's available as well. So finally, I should just acknowledge that everything I've been talking about, most of the things I've been talking about have benefited from talking to other people, either from other people doing the work or for me doing the work and other people helping express it or something like that. And so Gabrielle Allen, who was my co-program officer when I started, and Rajiv Ramnath, who is my co-program officer now, have been very helpful. And then the people listed down on the bottom are just other people that I talked to and got some feedback from and have helped with some of the way some of these things were presented. So, final question. So what will you do to make things better? All right. Again, things will change over time. Part of that will be generational change as new people that are graduate students and are more used to software kind of bubble through the academic system. But ideally, it would be nice if we could do something that happened sooner. And you might be a user of software, a developer of software, just a member of your institution where software is important, and probably a member of the overall scientific community. And in all these cases, there should be things that you can do. So finally, I'll just say thank you, and if there are questions, I'd be happy to take them now or later. So thank you. Okay, and I don't know what we do for remote questions, if there are any.
We actually reserve like 1 more hour for students to be able to have more detailed communication with our students. So feel free to ask questions.
So I can, probably follow our discussion earlier. It's not just me, but others as well. Sometimes I submit a proposal to like IIS program, not necessarily the other program, but some reviewers like criticize like this is more like even though this idea is new, the software you develop is new, but it's more like a software engineer problem instead of a
Yeah.
like research.
Right.
So do you think in
Right.
the future, I mean, your slides looks, I mean, they better make sense. But do you think in the future NSF will change?
Right.
I mean, the
Right.
boundary between
Yeah. Yeah.
the software construction and the scientific contribution, for me, seems not that clear.
Right, right. So let's see. So just, I guess, for the people that are remote, kind of the question, I think, if I can say it quickly, was for people that have software development as part of what they want to do or all of what they want to do. Basically, how does it seems like the overall NSF maybe doesn't recognize that very well and makes it hard to fund projects like that, and what's going to happen in the future. Is that more or less? Okay. So I think the answer is that unfortunately it depends on what area you're in right now. So some areas like the life sciences and biology in particular have particular programs that are just based on software as infrastructure, and the ABI program is one of those for work that would benefit the biological sciences community. The SI2 program that I talked about is intended to go across NSF and allow people that want to do software development to have that funded in any area that NSF supports. The challenge is that if you're trying to do both research and software development, that's something that's very hard to do under one project today, I think. And so my advice actually would be to try to divide it up into 2 different pieces, right? One that's the research piece and one that's the software that's intended to be more for a community, and to try to propose each of them separately into the places they fit. I would like to say that in the future there will be better answers to that, and we've talked internally about some programs that might try to kind of bridge that, but they don't exist right now. The other thing is that I think if I think of kind of myself and some of the software that I've developed in the past, I often kind of go through multiple stages, right? Where I do something for myself, and then I think maybe this is going to be useful for other people as well. Maybe it's worth putting in some extra effort and seeing if I can, improve the user interface, improve the documentation, see if other people want to use it or contribute. And so there's that kind of choice that you make somewhere along the way, that you either want to make that extra effort or you don't want to make it. And I think right now the answer that we have is that we have programs that if you say yes, you want to make that effort, we have particular programs that you can apply to. If you say no, then there's all the existing programs. If you don't know, it's actually kind of hard if you decide in the middle of a project. And so that's kind of what we're thinking about, is different ways that we could say, all right, this project has been doing good work, and now if we gave it a supplement perhaps, right, we could take that work and publish it as software as opposed to just publishing it as papers. And so we'd like to move in that direction, but that's probably in the future a bit.
So I have a question related to this.
Yeah.
Usually we have a research project proposing the proposal, and we always budget for graduate students too. But in fact, if you want to go to the level, maybe not research impact, but also the project, the product, or software, which seems like useful
Yeah.
for people to use, then you probably will be better off hire the engineer or staff or something
Yeah.
rather than graduate
Yeah.
student, because the overhead of training a graduate student from the beginning to the end is it's very high.
Right.
So, but I do not see the mechanism. Can we go that path, like a budget for a research project with a staff or an engineer?
Right. So let's see. So the question was that research projects often have graduate students for a variety of reasons, but if you're going to be producing software in that research project, it might be better to have a professional software person of some sort, and can we budget that, budget for that? And I think the answer, I guess I'm going to go back to the previous answer and say that if the intent of the project is to do research, then probably having the graduate students doing the research is right. And if the purpose of the project is to build software, then proposing it into a program where the goal is software development and maintenance probably is right. And in that latter category, you certainly can have professional software engineers as part of your budget, and that's almost expected. And in the former, it probably isn't. So again, I'm afraid that it's something where you almost have to make a choice of which outcome you're trying to do. Is it a research project or is it a software project? And we don't really have a good answer for the ones that are in between. I guess I should say, though, also for the software projects, the reviewers in general don't necessarily care what the title of the person who's going to be doing the development is. So it could be a graduate student, it could be somebody whose title is software engineer, it could be somebody whose title is postdoc or something else. But what they want to see is what's the evidence that that person knows how to do what they're going to do. So if you're naming a person and it's a graduate student, and you can say, all right, this graduate student has contributed to these projects previously, or this graduate student maintains this open source project, then that's going to be good. Whereas if you maybe you're just saying, I'm going to have a software developer, but you can't say who that's going to be necessary yet, then that also can be okay as well. Right? If you're going to say that I'm going to have a graduate student, but I don't know who that graduate student is, then that's where maybe questions will come in terms of software development. Right? How are you going to find a student that both knows the science and is a software developer, which may be harder. So. Yeah.
Hi. First, I wanted to thank you just for bringing up some of the challenges in relation to career paths as a PhD student. It's really interesting to see the NSF worry about that. Concerned about that. You talked a bit about infrastructure in relation to supporting science, and then also mentioned we have these problems of portability and sustainability. And I at least had the initial thought that you could kind of combine the two somewhat. If you're providing this infrastructure to researchers, you could also potentially build in those mechanisms for portability or for reproducibility. Virtualization is kind of the first idea that comes to mind, but there could be more. Are there efforts underway that look at this more directly, at that sort of combination, or if we build this infrastructure and people come to it, we can kind of force them to not force, but give tools, provide tools that kind of help those problems and challenges.
Right. Okay. So I guess, let's see, that question was, I guess because NSF is supporting infrastructure, can it use that supportive infrastructure to help address some of these other challenges like reproducibility or sustainability? And I think the answer in a very general sense is yes, but in a specific sense probably is not yet. So the reason that I say that is that the infrastructure that NSF is supporting is not a unified infrastructure or a single infrastructure. It's a bunch of different kind of pieces that individual researchers pick up and use as they want to. All right, so just as an example on the computing side, there's the Exceed resources, a bunch of HPC systems at different universities. There's NCAR systems for people that are working in the atmospheric sciences in particular. There are campus systems that in some cases NSF is supporting, but NSF isn't going to say this is the system that you should use or things like that and limit what the infrastructure is. I think on the other hand though, there is a goal to move towards a more defined national cyber infrastructure. And as we do that, then we might start to think about what are the services that are needed for software to be more sustainable or more portable or something like that. And so I think we might move in that direction over time, but I think it's still coming a little bit in the future. We are, though, I would say, supporting tools. In SI2, there are some tools that are intended to help with some portability challenges and some reproducibility challenges. And I think in computer science research in particular, There certainly is funding available for people that want to do research in those directions, even if they're not quite building the tools yet. So I think a lot of the pieces are there, but they haven't really come together at this point. Okay, yep.
What do you think will be the future of software? Given now we so much data and people actually almost everyone can write a piece of code now in the future. So what is your vision? You think will software become a kind of a pay for service kind of thing, and the interoperability of a different workflow to form the software, make software to work as a workflow, all these future things like Google has driverless car. What is the future direction for software development in the future?
Okay, so that was a really good final question. What is the future direction for software development? So I think I can kind of answer pieces of that. Maybe I don't think I can answer the whole thing by any means. And anything that you say about the future is always dangerous. But I guess it seems to me to be very likely that that the ability to develop software, as you said, is going to become more common, right? And that in particular as the computer science education goes forward, right? Computer science is going to be something that almost all students will study at some point before they get to college. And as such, I think then the question really becomes what is going on in that education, right? Are people being educated again to become software developers and to understand what best practices are? Or are they becoming educated more in computational thinking, where the software is not the important part, but it's more the idea that's the important part, and how they're approaching problems and solving problems. And so I guess I would hope that it's going to be a little bit of both, and that as we start to push some of the computer science education more broadly, that part of that will include software development, kind of best practices. But I don't know. I'm not sure what the answer is at this point. I think it'll be an interesting question to try to look at over time.